Start talking about Atlantis. And we'll get all through it and past it in 2 talks. Again, when we're talking about Atlantis, there are a lot of illusions about it. One of the big illusions is thinking that the Atlanteans had all kinds of scientific techniques that they could use to do various different things, that they were highly technically advanced. And compared to us, it's not at all true. And I'll never forget, I had a conversation with somebody at one time, and they were telling me about all the wonders that the Atlanteans had. And they said they had a machine that they could take water out of the air and use it for drinking. And I said, oh, like our condensers in a refrigerator or in a dehumidifier. And they were stung like a bee. They wanted to think that the Atlanteans knew something very magical and that it wasn't, that the laws of nature or that the way nature worked was different for the Atlanteans because they were Atlanteans. In fact, I even think that whole principle has something to say for it, because the precipitation of the atmospheric moisture is what the Atlanteans were all about. Okay, Atlantis. When? Where? Normally, people talk about Atlanteans in terms of thirds. That is, thirds of time, and that those thirds of time were usually marked by developments in the change of consciousness of the people and by developments in the earth itself. However, those are, if we were to draw a scale to try and indicate what they aren't like, say, this is a linear concept of the time that was Atlantis. Here ended Lemuria, and here ended Atlantis. When they say a third, it wouldn't be like that, just dividing a third. I think the way it went, because it's the way things go in evolution, things go during the involutionary course of things go very, very slowly. So I think it would probably be something like this, that it would be a telescopic third. That this would be a third, and this would be the second third, and this would be the third third, that things got shorter by a third each time. Like the second third would be 1/3 of the first third, and such like that. So that's not very useful or not very helpful. It's very unclear telling, because part of the reason is because time meant something different. Time is a measure of spiritual consciousness in experience. And if we had a more timeless consciousness, the measure of it was different then, the way things changed. The whole cosmos itself has a sliding scale of what time is. Another reason is it's not only incomprehensible, but it's meaningless. To say, well, I spent 5 hours doing this or that, it all depends on what those 5 hours mean. So, for an Atlantean consciousness, the time would mean something different. Also, there are things about Atlantis that the time is kept secret, because if we understood the gradations of time in evolution, we could manipulate circumstances that people lived in, and we could have a much more horrible influence over people than we have now. This is one of the reasons why the mysteries are very secret about the time of things. Roughly speaking, the time of Atlantis is an arc of time that extends from when there was a massive vulcanization, especially in the southern hemisphere, and most of the incrustation of the earth was overpoured by lava, and most of the civilization that was associated with that was destroyed. That marks the beginning of Atlantis. And the end of Atlantis, of the last little piece or third of Atlantis, was probably about 10,000 years ago. When that last island, which is sometimes called Atlantis, sometimes called Poseidonus in the mid-Atlantic ridge, went down and other land masses went up in its place. When that island went down around 10,000 years ago, that marked the complete and utter final end. There still are historical records of giant-like people living up until that time and occasionally meeting the Highlanders, which are ourselves. Obviously, there are overlaps. Things don't go along. Like we have a line of demarcation, and we say this is midnight, and everything on this side of midnight is Wednesday, and everything on this side of midnight is Thursday. Things don't happen like that with evolution. There's always a continuous chain of things, so that things are phased off to one degree or another. So this might be a time called Lemuria, and some of the effects of Lemuria might extend all the way into what would be called the post-Atlantean times, and there would be overlap of Atlantis and Lemuria. So you can't really say when one ends, one begins, and another ends. It's a meaningless kind of thing to say. If you want to have some kind of time scale, it has to be at least in tens of millions of years, and potentially hundreds of millions of years is possible. The closest that I have seen in time estimation for the end of Lemuria, it was 90,000 years ago, which is not really believable to me at all. The early third of Atlantis I have seen as marked as early as 250,000 years ago. On the other hand, we have skeletal remains that we know at least are 10 and 12 million years old, and some occult students claim that there are Atlantean types of fossils that go back 18 million years ago. All right, so it's at least tens of millions of years. So that has told us nothing. We're just sort of warming up to the subject. Where was Atlantis? Again, there is idea that Atlantis was an island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, no more, no less, and that was it. According to the mysteries, it was different than that. That, according to the mysteries, the basins where the oceans are now were not always filled with water, that the water was vaporous. And in those basins, it was hot and warm, and this was the chosen place for the Atlanteans to live, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So that in the early third of Atlantis, the people lived in the basins. More the Atlantic Basin than the Pacific Basin, because the Pacific Basin was too vulcanized and too hot to a large extent, especially the South Pacific Basin. In later times in Atlantis, the Atlanteans lived in the lowlands. As the waters began to rise, or as the water began to precipitate, they began to live in the low islands, and eventually in the last third they were concentrated in a very few islands, mostly in the Atlantic Ocean, but probably also in places like the Easter Islands and places like that, where they had all of those great statues where they were worshiping the body and such. So the when and where of Atlantis is in terms more of events. When, that is from the last volcanization that ended most of the Lemurian civilization, and where mostly in the lowlands. All right, now we can start looking at a much more detailed picture. First, we have the Earth being thrown off inside of the sun, or inside of the solar system, which was becoming a sun with planets. And the Earth was very hot, and the Earth was molten, surrounded by a dense atmosphere. At first, that atmosphere was more similar to the atmosphere of the outer planets in the nature of the substance that it had, but not in the temperature. Like a lot of the outer planets, like Uranus and Saturn, are a lot of frozen methane and other hydrocarbon gases. The Earth was hot enough so that the gases, hydrocarbon gases, surrounded the Earth, but did not freeze. And there's evidence in terms of evolution that at one time the earliest forms, outward forms and expressions of life were anaerobic bacteria. And the anaerobic bacteria changed the atmosphere of the Earth by producing oxygen, and they can now only survive underground or away from oxygen, and we now have the aerobic bacteria. So the atmosphere of the planet clears up from the methane gases and is surrounded mostly by vapor. Then, for various spiritual as well as material reasons, the slag which was drifting up and congealing as planetary masses in one place becomes very congealed and very thick, and it gets thrown off as our moon. And that causes a change in the whole environment of the Earth, and the Earth remelts. And gradually, as it remelts, as it re-encrusts, there are periods of major volcanizations, especially in the part of the Earth where the heat was greatest from the moon having been ripped off. So we have an Earth then that is cooling down, it's contracting, but it occasionally has upheavals, and upheavals in the form mostly of volcanism early. Then what happens is that as it cools, there are critical times, using the word as it is used by physics, that the atmosphere of the Earth reaches the critical degree. And when it reaches the critical degree, there are major rains, and the water falls and it precipitates. Now, various times there are these inundations, but there are other conditions that are also changing. The Earth is very irregular. It really hasn't steadied itself. The people haven't steadied themselves. And there is a movement that occult astronomers find that the Earth falls end over end on its axis. At one time, the southern hemisphere pointed directly at the sun, much as the moon and Venus and Uranus point, one of the poles of them points directly at the sun. And then even though the Earth was still warm, because part of it was not being heated up by solar heat, a very unusual circumstance occurred where the northern area, what is now called the northern area, was covered with ice. The southern area was double heated. It was heated by the sun, pointing directly at the sun all the time, and it was heated by the vulcanization. And so that at first there was a fog surrounding the earth that was a consequence of just the general heat of the whole earth body. Then a different kind of fog occurred even after the precipitation, because you have warm blasts of air coming up from the southern areas, and you have cold air coming down from the northern areas, and they tend to follow along the valleys or the basins, which are like the Atlantic Basin and the Pacific Basin. And when you have warm air and cold air meeting each other, you have not only a vapor, but you have a foggy, misty type of vapor. So for almost all of the Atlantean period, there was a dense atmosphere. First just vapor, and then a misty, foggy vapor later on. This is talked about in a lot of mythologies, like the Norse mythology is probably the most scientific of all the mythologies, but they talk about the heat coming up from Muspelheim and the cold coming down from Niflheim, and that this produced the foggy atmosphere in which they called the Atlanteans, they had another name for them. They had it was the Nibelungen, the children of the mist that lived underwater. This explains a lot of very interesting things, because there are a lot of things to scratch your head about if you study evolutionary theory. Because how could our trees, which require a long period of evolution, and most of our above water plants have evolved to be the way they were so quickly? And there's all of this evidence of things being underwater, but it really wasn't underwater, it was under mist. And when you understand that the atmosphere was much more watery in nature, it's easier to understand the development of the different species from a suboceanic to superoceanic state. It's a really interesting thing. I'm sure everybody's all interested in it. So that sort of describes the physical conditions in a rough way of Atlantis. It also brings up another interesting thing. Remember, we started talking about the polarizations. And the polarizations, whenever there's polarization, there's always alternation. And this says then that the Lemurians were destroyed by vulcanization or fire. And the Atlanteans were ultimately destroyed by water. Because when the rains came down, some of them still breathed through the gill sacs, and they couldn't breathe clear air the way we breathe. And as a consequence, the civilization of Atlantis was destroyed by water. In fact, the last destruction was an inundation. And so that's where that, you've read the thing in the Bible, and they even talk about it in folk songs, Christian spiritual folk songs, like it says, no more water but a fire next time. That the promise was that there would be no more floods, and that the next destruction of earth or civilization will be by fire again, alternately by fire and water, and it will be an etheric fire as is described in the book of Revelation. But that's not exactly what we're talking about. So, we've said all along that there is paralleling changes in the physical conditions of the earth in nature. There are conditions that change in the physical nature of human beings and in the consciousness of human beings. It's especially important that the changes in the atmosphere and in the physical conditions come as much from the human beings working on nature as nature working on the human beings. Because we are part of the creative hierarchy, And with our perception of the external world and with our nascent, budding creativity, we change the cosmos, especially the earth on which we live. That's one of our greatest activities of evolution, is to change the cosmos. All right? So we want to look at several trends. We're trying to look at the history of humanity. We spent about 3 talks looking at the critical time of when we became human-like. And when we look at what the human-like evolution has been since then, since Lemuria and through Atlantis and into our times, we can get an idea of our place in our work so that we can fit our consciousness wakingly to work along with the process to help the process go on to be a better part of it. The ultimate purpose for all of these talks, even though they're on cosmology, is very practical. It is to see exactly what principles underlie the universe, what their reasons for being are, and where they are taking us, or at least where they are leading us, so that we can, there will someday be a final third set of talks, and that final third set of talks will be on the personal aspects of spiritual living. What kind of living is pro-evolutionary, and how is that living based on cosmic principle? It's sort of very much like saying, well, you can study, you can see that the body needs so much of this vitamin and so much of this mineral. Therefore, if you have a diet that incorporates these things, your physical body's needs will be met and you'll be healthy. And we're saying we're going to examine in the same way where we're going and what we can do with our consciousness to be working with the ends of evolution. Okay, so let's look at general trends of the development of human beings from the early part of Atlantis through to our times. And there are general trends, and if we can see them, then we can get an idea of the way they're going now. In general, we went from having larger bodies to having smaller bodies. The reason, there are a number of reasons for this. One, there is a physical principle that if you live in a denser atmosphere and are warm-blooded like a mammal, you can produce a larger body in a denser atmosphere. This is what allows whales to become whales. Whales, in terms of evolution, are closest to little tiny shrews. And little tiny shrews, there are shrews right now, freshwater shrews, that dive in the water and swim in the water for insects and little minnows and things like that. But by living in the water, especially living in a dense water like salt water, the greater pressure allows the body to grow larger by having a stronger buffer with the environment. And so the Atlanteans in the early stages had very large bodies. Some of them were as large as 30 feet tall. Another reason for the larger bodies versus the smaller bodies is that the higher vehicles were not as active and active self-consciously. The more, like for example, if you take a plant, as long as a plant lives, it grows. That is the definition of a plant. It has only the vital body and the dense mineral body. So as long as it's living, it grows, and that's its existence. So if you have something like a giant sequoia or a redwood or something like that, it doesn't get to a certain size and stop. There's nothing to curb the vital body. But if you take an animal, especially an animal with a nervous system, it grows to a certain size and it reaches maturity and it stops growing and it stays at that size. That's because the desire body enters in, and a lot of the creative energies, instead of being spent only on growth, are spent in acting out desires. The same principle is accounted for in a much greater extent with the mind. When the mind comes to play, and it comes to play through the nervous system, this puts a curb on desire and on vitality, and it lessens the amount that one grows. In Lemurian times and earlier, the desire body and the mind were of very little effect. The mind actually wasn't even really born then. And in early Atlantis, the emotions and mentality were very, very minimal. And as a consequence, they did not, like in the animals, the desire bodies and such like that were also very, the animals were much lazier then. I think the idea is where you start talking about the ferocity of, the dinosaurs and tyrannosaurs and things like that. They weren't that fierce. It wasn't like cheetahs or something like that, or packs of wolves running down their prey. It was a much easier matter because the desire effect hadn't come into being that much. Another reason is that we responded to the contraction and to the cooling. If there's nothing that takes your body heat away, if you live in a very warm atmosphere, and you happen to be lowly mental and lowly desire, you can put a lot more into growth. But when things start becoming cool, that's what they say. Why do you get a cold? Because you took a chill, you were in a draft. That sounds silly in some ways until you understand the principle. If your vital body, if the energy of your vital body is spent in maintaining body heat because of the evaporation of water that's on you, or because of having to deal with the draft, then that weakens your vital body, and the vital body can't throw off the things that would invade it that we would call bacteria and viruses and things like that would be called illnesses. So there really is something to the notion of getting in a draft or taking in a chill or something like that. And so with the contraction and with the cooling of the earth, we responded in decrease in size. Also, our consciousness became more concentrated. And in a physical sense, it even holds in the zodiac, that the more concentrated people, like if you think about Capricornian things, the more concentrated people usually are more diminutive in size. Now, this is something really interesting. The texture of our bodies was more coarse and hard in early Atlantis, and it became softer and more refined in later Atlantis. Even though we could almost walk through an early Atlantean, there's a difference between density and texture. And so that it's like we hadn't, in our consciousness, we hadn't thoroughly impregnated our body with our divine intelligence, our divine consciousness, and brought the texture of it to a different state. And for that reason, we were coarser. That's the only reason we could take all the torture and such like we went through in Lemuria. We also went from becoming more systemically simple beings to becoming more systemically complex beings. We didn't have much of a nervous system. We didn't have all of the many kinds of muscles. Because muscles, the whole muscular system, is a direct expression of desire. If you play a musical instrument, you build new muscles and new nerves to serve them in order to do certain things. And, it's sort of like Sherlock Holmes. He could tell just by looking at the handprint of somebody or at the hand what kind of profession that they had, because he could tell how they had changed their musculature to do what they were doing as physical activities. And so the complexity and the ability in the physical body in terms of refinement and specialization and adaptation was much greater in the latter part of Atlantis than it was in the earlier part of Atlantis. We went from being less neural to being more neural. That is, we went more toward thought and sensation. That is, we went from being more slouched to being more upright, directing the creative energies upwards. We went more to being able to sense things, to be tuned into what was going on outside of ourselves, and to be able to control ourselves and to have conclusions about the nature of what was going on outside of ourselves. In fact, not only were we tall, but we were more limby than we are now. The legs were huge and the arms were huge. The head was tiny. You can still see pictures of people from several thousand years ago among the Incas. They're not around, many of those Incas anymore, but they're described exactly as people describe the bodies of Atlanteans, except that they aren't super tall. The head started sloping back at the eyebrows already. It was, I got some pictures somewhere that described the principle. It's like they were almost like pin-headed, and there was none of this area was there at all, because the brain capacity hadn't been developed, and all the convolutions of the brain hadn't been developed, and all of the, because at that time, the pineal was a much more external organ, because it was a heat sensor, as we said in Lemuria. But as the brain built around it, it became much more of an interior organ. The ears were set much further back on the head toward the hindbrain, because they were more associated with instinctual activity than they were associated with listening to music and things like that. So we also went from being more stringy and almost plant-like to being softer. And most of the softness went in the organs, and most especially the lungs. Because in order to breathe in those times, see, breathing is very important. We're going to talk more about it next time, because inspiration really means breathing, taking in spirit or taking in breath. And the same word that is soul in the Hebrew language is the same as the word breath. And this was associated with the oxygenation of blood. And the oxygenation of blood is what is necessary for burning and maintaining metabolic heat. And having an internal heat is what is important. Like burning inside of ourselves is a spiritual, it's like we're creating the beginning of our own little sun. When we have our own internal heat, and we have to have a certain amount of inner warmth and a certain temperature for the spirit to be indwelling, and then when it is indwelling, we can look out into external reality and draw things from it and create in it. And so the taking in of oxygen was all important. We took in smaller, lower amounts of oxygen in the early part of Atlantis, because we were still ruled from without. And we got all of our heat from without, almost like animals now like to lie in the sun, or like those great big giant sponges and clams and things like that grow where there are areas of vulcanization. under the earth where there are cracks like in the Pacific Ocean. That warm temperature allows them to grow larger. It's easier kind of living. And so as long as we had the external guidance and the external warmth, we didn't need that much oxygen. But as the atmosphere kept getting thinner, as the spirit kept more wanting to draw in, it was necessary to have more oxygen. And to do that, we had to give up having gill sacs. You know, like a fish can just sit there and they don't really breathe. They just sort of move the gills a little bit and they get a minimal amount of oxygen. That's why we always refer to fish as cold fish, because they don't have body warmth. And what used to be the gill sacs have now become the eustachian tubes. They still perform a mercurial function, and they're now more closely associated with providing the proper pressure for mercurial hearing than they are with providing the oxygen. And the greatest softening in the body came with another Atlantean activity, the murder that we talk about when we talked about the first sin, the sin of selfish sexuality, leading to the second sin, the sin of Cain, that of murder. That became the whole way of life. And when we started coming into the physical world, then we had to do something in order to maintain our bodies and evolve them so we could have warmth. And what we had to do to maintain that warmth was to have oxygen. And to do that, we had to build lungs. And to build lungs, we had to eat flesh food. If we hadn't sunk as deeply into matter, we wouldn't have had to have eaten flesh food the way we did. So we ate a lot of animal food, and the more animal food we ate, the more lungs we got. You might even say now that the Aquarian age is coming on, and we're looking to do less with less and less oxygen. This is another reason why it's not a good idea to eat meat a lot in our times. Okay, so we went from being more stringy to being softer. We also went from being more impulsive to being more smooth in our movements and in our lives, because it was sort of, our waking consciousness was sort of catch as catch can. Now we had it and now we didn't. And literally, when we moved, it used to be that it was necessary in order to escape from streams of lava and things like that. When the earth was cooling down, we had to make huge leaps. And so we actually bounded around closer to like the way kangaroos bound than the way humans walk now. So there was more things were more irregular, and now we're more steady. So we went from an external heat to an internal heat. Now the whole Earth period, we're still talking about the Earth period, and we're talking about the fourth revolution of the Earth period, with 3 more to come, and we're talking about the downward swing of the fourth revolution of the Earth period, and that is divided into 2 halves. The whole first 3.5 swings are associated with Mars. This is why the days of the week go Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Mars Day. Woensdag Day to Mercury. The Earth period is divided into 2 halves, the first half being martial, the second half being mercurial, which is why we don't have an Earth Day as one of the 7 days of the week. It's because we're on the inside looking out. We're in the Earth looking, Now the influence, then, of Mars externally and internally was very, very important. And it was in increasing importance as our evolution increased and we sank more deeply into matter. And that is that the quality of Mars affected everything that it rules in the Earth with greater and greater vigor. Obviously, this is why the Lucifers knew this, and this is why we could be moved to do what we did by the Lucifers, because Mars is much less, it's much more thoughtless than Mercury. It's much more driving, jamming, and impulsive. And as a consequence, we were much more warlike. Our sins were sins of commission, and our diseases were infectious diseases. And we were under Mars' influence. And the effect of the Mars influence was to both polarize the martial elements and to sensitize them. That is to say that the magnetism that we have, that the only outside of iron, there's only dysprosium and one or two other elements that have a magnetic polarity. And that polarization of Mars and the attunement to the delicate changes that are possible in the, and you know, if you're familiar with the way the carbon dioxide and oxygen work in a very delicate balance in the bloodstream. And that sensitive balance of the oxygen and carbon dioxide over the iron in the blood is a result of the hierarchies associated with Mars polarizing our consciousness, erecting our bodies, and bringing that kind of influence of being doers, of being actors, of being motivated people. Eventually, the same thing is supposed to be happening with Mercury. That is, with Quicksilver. Quicksilver is the next thing to be polarized, and its influence on us is to bring the mental qualities to play to overcome the excessive martial things and to instead bring more deliberation and more thought. I wonder sometimes about the mercury poisoning, whether it is all that bad. I imagine it's a little excessive, but it's a proven factor. Like, for example, the passion of an individual goes down quite a bit by taking in mercury and allied minerals to mercury, like bismuth and things like that. All right, that's neither here nor there. And so those were some of the general trends. Now, paralleling this were things that this is how we changed. If we were looking at a fast-forward movie that went over millions of years, these are the kinds of trends or changes that were in our consciousness. And there were parallels in nature, or with nature. In nature, there became a closer, more competitive, tighter kind of consciousness. It wasn't all just like a Garden of Eden where everything was readily taken care of, but the influence of our sinful consciousness brought not necessarily sin to the other animals, but brought a different, sharper-edged type of consciousness to their evolution. Also, our consciousness becoming more detailed and becoming more specialized resulted in much, much greater complication and ramification in every part of nature. Some cases it's carried almost too far. Even trees now which don't need it are gender differentiated. And so what we did is we made nature much more complex than ever. In fact, this is a trend that's continuing down to our own time. Only I think it's gotten so far now that it's counterproductive, that the outlook of science, which is purely mental and is not generalizing or is not unifying things together, in order to study the movement of one particle from one place to the next place, takes hours and hours and hours on the fastest computers to just be able to determine the movement from one place to another, because we have such a complex understanding of the way the cosmos is, rather than just having a simple, let me just move this from here to there kind of consciousness. And because of that, so what I'm saying is our consciousness has affected nature. We actually, in our appreciation, have beautified nature. That every time we go out into nature and look at it and appreciate it, we add more to it. What I'm trying to say is, if there were no vision in nature, it would be unnecessary for nature to accentuate the quality of beauty. Just the experience of the lessons that would be necessary would be all that would be necessary, all that would be required. But we, seeing the glories of creation and becoming more perceptive and outward, we can appreciate the divine wisdom that has gone in to the creation with a sense of beauty. And with that being the case with our external consciousness, we have in fact made nature become more beautiful. The same is true that we have necessitated other changes. Boy, I think I'm going to pass on that one. The earth itself has become less irregular, in the same way that we used to leap around in irregular jerks. The earth itself used to snap with irregular jerks, because if the pole is pointing at the sun and the other pole builds an ice cap, it becomes eccentric, and it used to snap and jerk around like that. And so what I'm saying is that in all of these trends of consciousness that took place in us, there have been trends of change in the earth. And the same thing is true, that we became more internal relative to a more durable externality. The same thing is true with the core-like quality of the earth becoming more differentiated with the outer core at the same time as the outer core. Okay, now we have to do a little bit of general review. To get to the purposes, or some of the purposes, of Atlantean existence. First of all, we had the Saturn period. And in the Saturn period, the cosmos was no more dense than thought. Then we had the Sun period, and the whole cosmos in which we evolved was no more dense than desire. Then we had the Moon period, and the cosmos was no more dense than ether. And finally, in the Earth period, it gets to be as dense as it's going to get. Physical matter. If we look at what happened to human beings in this time, in the Saturn period, we developed the physical body. And we were mineral-like. So we were thought minerals. Then we developed the vital body in the moon period, in the sun period, and we were desire plants. And in the moon period, we developed the desire body, and we were ether animals. And finally, we developed the mind in the earth period, and we are physical humans. So you see there is a crossover that when the world was like thought, we developed our physical nature. When the world was physical, we developed our mind. So there is sort of a crossover that's been happening throughout all of evolution. Now, paralleling this, in the fourth revolution of the Earth period, we have Polaris. We were still part of the sun. And in paralleling this, we had Hyperborea. When we were still part of the sun, and we were human beings, but we were plant-like human beings. And then we had Lemuria, part of which we were animal-like human beings, and in the earth, separated within the sun. And in this time, something happened. A stratification happened in the desire bodies of those who were ready. That is, there was a differentiation between the desires that were necessary for survival and the desires that went beyond survival. And in the upper part of the stratified desire body, we developed the lower nature. That is the second self, or the personal ego. In Atlantis, there became the birth of the mind, and it was the birth of the concrete mind. And the birth of the concrete mind was put together with the lower nature of the desire body, and it produced the cunning thing that we call personality or personal ego right now. And this focus of mind, of a physical mind put together with desire, produced an extremely rapid kind of condensation of matter and all of the elaborate things that have happened in evolution. So this describes the work of Atlantis. Atlantis is the fourth epoch of the fourth revolution of the fourth period. And that 4 always associates with earthification and with the development of mind in earthification. You know, the 1 always is Saturn, and the 2 is the sun, and the 3 is the moon, but the 4 is always Earth. So the fourth of the fourth of the fourth is a period of immense earthification brought about by the development of mind. If we understand this principle, we understand the purpose of Atlantis. The purpose in Atlantis was to condense the earth and to become mentally very much aware of the earth. Different than our time. Our work is a much different kind of work. And so, all right, now that brings us to the point, there's Saturn, Sun, Moon, Earth. And we're talking about right around what happens just before the turnaround when we go back up again through Jupiter. The Mercury half is... And this is the last little bit when you're going down the hill, lickety-split. And this is the turnaround, and this is the momentum, and this is the densification. Okay, now we have to talk about the issue that is extremely sensitive. And we have to talk about it, because if we didn't, we wouldn't be talking about realities that exist in nature that are now, by the liberal intellectual establishment, not even talked about, because it's just considered something that we don't really know and it doesn't make any difference. We have to talk about the means whereby in humans this rapid densification was to take place. Now, this is a very, very ripe time. It's a very dangerous time, because it's a time when we're the furthest away from spirituality and impelling into matter as we should, maybe not as to the extent that we did, but impelling very much into it. This led to a differentiation of forms of cosmic wisdom that were explicit representations or manifestations of archetypal knowledge in the divine plan. I don't know how to say this really carefully. This is like saying that specific forms have built into them, in these specialized, separated, elaborate ways, each specific form is a manifestation of part of the divine plan, a very segregated part of the divine plan. And when you segregate something out of its universality, it still maintains the potency, but it can very easily be misunderstood and very easily be misused. This is like what we've talked about in the astrology class a lot, that different animals each represent a different kind of wisdom. Each one is a living embodiment of a cosmic principle. It's like saying, you see, before we were this deep into matter, and we were in the inner worlds, the wisdom and the form of wisdom were sort of buffered into each other. But in order to effect things when there is an externality, especially an externality where the divine hierarchies cannot wakingly enter in, then it has to be built right into the structure. And that is saying that there are certain forms of experience that are representations of what is meant to be learned in the divine. And they're specialized in different types of material existence. Tough to deal with. It's like a musical instrument. You can get into playing a musical instrument where the musical instrument represents a means of expressing music, but you can get so involved with that musical instrument that you can't separate yourself from the instrument. Or like when you learn to drive a car, the first time that I drove a car, I was about 19 years old. And the first time I drove a car, I thought I was driving Grand Central Station down the street. And if somebody were to tell me that I could move that car 1 inch without jerking or without choking it off or without leaping forward, I wouldn't have believed it. And after a while, you and your car become so much one that it's hard to separate. In fact, a lot of people do dangerously identify with their automobiles, and they get their egos all tied up in it. But it's also like tools. If you're going to do a garden, there's a progressive set of tools you have to go through. The first thing you do is you use a spade. And the spade breaks up the solid earth. It breaks it into clumps. And you use another tool to break it down further, and you use a rake for another purpose, and a hoe for another purpose, and later on you use a knife or something for yet another purpose. Each tool is by necessity a step in progress. Which brings us to the tools we have to talk about. The names of these tools, it's a terrible name and it's very much misunderstood. Races. In Atlantean times, when we were coming into matter, it was necessary in this time for experiences to be learned through, it's like going through a sequence of tools, or like going through a sequence, it's almost like a medley of songs. You do this song, and then you do this song, and then you do this song. But the intention is that by experiencing the manifest wisdom in various types of forms, they represent steps. But they represent very, very dangerous steps, because it's easy to get attached to them. And so when we're talking about the reality of races, which is altogether different than what exists in our time, we're just about at the time that there's nothing like race left anymore. We're going to talk more about that in a lecture after. For the next 2 lectures, we're going to be talking about this sort of thing. So we must, above all things, we must take some precautions. When we're talking about races, we're talking about kinds of experience. And I think the word race is an excellent word. I've looked it up in a number of etymological dictionaries, but it's not clear that the word race, meaning to run a race, versus race, to be involved in relatedness to other beings, come from the same root. That can't be traced back. But I like the idea of treating them the same. A race is something that you run through as quickly as you can. You see, there are two dangers. I think I'll wait with that. We'll come to that later. So we have to differentiate always the difference in the same way that we have to differentiate that we are not our automobiles. And that because we have a powerful automobile, we are powerful. And because somebody else is riding a jalopy or is forced to walk, that does not make us superior to them. So I think that the distinction always has to be made that there is a difference between the spirit and the form in which it is abiding. And in Atlantis, the spirits were led through racial experience after racial experience after racial experience. In our times, it's much different. It's all a matter of choice. We choose what kind of body and what kind of culture we want to come into, because we're on the upswing now. In Atlantis, the people were still led from without. That warm red blood, the self-conscious direction was not there. So the people were led through the races. However, they could still hang on if they wanted to. And that was a very, very great danger. So what we're talking about is that these are tools. And that there is surrounding each of the races, in Atlantis especially, in our times it's different, there is a completely different experience which is almost like a species differentiation, such that if you were living in a rabbit's body versus living in a fox's body versus living in a hawk's body, that there would be a totally different kind of experience to each of them. In our times, it's more cultural and not so much form. It doesn't depend so much on the heredity as the cultural background. In fact, even most of the cultural physical things that surround it are drifting away. Ethnic food is disappearing. Ethnic language is disappearing. Ethnic music is disappearing. And all of those things that you used to get completely, if you were in that culture, you knew that culture and nothing more. You learned some wonderful things in that culture, but that was it. But now we don't even have the culture, and we're certainly moving away from the hereditary conditions. So the conditions are described that in Lemuria, those who underwent the stratification of the desire body preparatory to attaching the mind to it were called the human race. That is, those who were capable of moving on to individuation underwent this stratification. Then in Atlantis, in the same way, going all the way back to what we talked at the very beginning of this course, there were 7 races. And they were indeed more like species, because there were quite sharp physical differences between them. And then in the post-Atlantean times, in our times, there are 7 race cultures. That is, they were more like cultures. And then, as people free themselves from this and again unite in altruism, we go back to humanity, and then after that we become cosmic citizens again. So these 7 states, these 16 states, are sometimes called the 16 paths to destruction, because it's so treacherous to become attached to one of these 16 states and not to be completely unified with the cosmos. There are two dangers with regard to races. One is to not sufficiently enter them. It's the same way it is with a physical body. You can not adequately enter your body. And when that takes place, you don't get all the experience out of it. You sit there sort of in a dream or in a schizophrenic stare or something like that. You're what is called autistic. You're off in your own little world. And there are whole groups of people that time and time again refuse to enter into their body and refuse to enter into their racial, cultural circumstances. They deny the things that run through their blood and through their bones, and for that reason, they don't experience anything. The other danger, the much greater danger, is to enter too far into your physical. So far into the physical that you become attached to it and that you cannot see your spiritual nature as being something universal. That is the greatest danger. Obviously, what happens when you do become attached to the physical and you become very personally, selfishly attached to your physical, then obviously something that looks different, if you're insecure, something that looks different looks like an enemy. We right now are so attached to our physical comfort that we think of all of nature as an enemy. You think that it's almost like that. What's this artist's name that he'd probably want to wrap the whole world in plastic? Do you know what I mean? He's wrapped or on a whole island. He put that big thing, that fence across Northern California and such like that. You know, we go to the stores and everything's covered with plastic. Something like that is what is a danger. And you can see all of the bloodshed and warfare and racial fighting, all like that takes place with people who identify too strongly with their body. To call racism and to call racism with personal intent is to be locked into your own body. All right, that's the greater danger. And there are several reasons for it. One is too close of an involvement. I am my body, or I can't make music without my instrument. Take away my instrument and I can't do it. Another part of it is fear. We can cling to our bodies out of fear because we're so far away from the spiritual flow that would heal us and that would keep us aware. And because of insecurity, we grab more onto the material. Also, it's just habit. We get to like our bodies and we get to feel comfortable with them. And by habit, we go asleep to spirituality. And we like sleeping and we like sleeping in our bodies. And part of it is due to inversion. That when we start seeing the outer world, we see things upside down. And when we start seeing the inner world from that vantage point, we see it upside down. And we think we are the gods, which in a small way we are. And then we see things all backwards. And we actually worship our bodies. All right. This is an extremely important issue, and it's something that we're going to have to come back to again. I just want to make the point that you cannot tell what an individual is like by race. You have to know the spirit that is within. And it is not a shame to be in second grade. You're never going to get to third or fourth or college or anything else unless you go through second grade first. And because someone is passing through second grade, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you think that sixth grade is better than second grade, you might even be in a worse shape than somebody who's in second grade because you're being stuck with, you're stuck on sixth grade rather than moving on to something better because because the kids in seventh and eighth grade are so much ahead of you that you get stuck in sixth grade. Okay, so the point I want to make again is there's nothing wrong with the fact that there are races. And there's nothing wrong with the fact that there is progress through racial forms. What is a difficulty is to not properly appreciate the experience of that form by not coming into it or by indulging into it and clinging to it too strongly. Okay. It's a tough issue to deal with because it's so tough that most people avoid it altogether. I don't even think that in a modern anthropology course they cover it, or a psychology course or anything like that. Roughly, I want to talk I'll just give you the reports. The first, that's how it's really spelled? Yeah. That's the first Atlantean race. Very, very primitive. The activity was basically Lemurian. There were the beginnings of senses, and for the first time, senses of differentiable color and tone. Previous to that, like in Lemuria, the quality was that we felt pain, yes, and we felt comfort, but we couldn't always differentiate what would be called finer feelings. And the beginning, the rudest beginning of that, began with the Rumahals. Rumahals, I don't know how to pronounce it. And they had a little bit of memory that developed. This is really very primitive. So sensation had its beginning, and from sensation, a higher kind of feeling. This is again having to deal with the stratification of the desire body and memory. Proper spelling, yeah. The Tlavatlis, which supposedly the second Atlantean. Some people like Madame Blavatsky go into all of the sub-races within these, and they bend your tongue all out of place. With this, the progression was when there was a beginning in the stratified desire body of sensation and higher feeling. With the Tlavatlis, what came about was the beginning of a self-esteem. You might say an ego-esteem. And with this ego-esteem came ambition. And then, from the experiences born out of ambition, it became very important. Like this new ego had to be fed by not only by experience, but by remembered experience. So the Tlavatlis developed profound memories. And they developed a sense of honor and a sense of worship about these memories. The people who could experience the most and who had the greatest ambitions, they were remembered the most. And this marked the beginning of ancestral worship. The original Toltecs, not those from Central America, carried this much further. You'll note that in the first half, everything was much more associated, or the first third was associated with sensation and memory of sensation. The self-esteem that developed in the Tlavlatlis became worship of kings. It was like a divine monarchy. And because there was still the inner world consciousness and all of this ambition, they had power through the ethers of maintaining a memory over generations. That is, you still read about this in the Upanishads yet, and you read about it in statements from the ancient Atlanteans. They could pass things through the hereditary makeup from one generation to the next. And so the experiences were passed on from generation to generation. Moreover, also what happened, especially among the women, those in the women's bodies, when they were bringing up the children, they had the ability to take their memories, which were passed on to them from past generations, plus their own experiences. They could call up those memories in their children. So there was a hereditary memory, and then there was a memory that was brought to consciousness by being projected almost like a movie screen on the inner picture consciousness of the children. So there was enormous memory work. And these are people that could remember very faint and tiny details of experience, and they could remember them over generations. And enormous amounts of memory developed. And from this developed a kind of culture where when people had the hereditary transmission and they had the things that were given to them by their parents, by the mother especially, flashing onto their memory, plus all of their life, they became wise elders. And this is sort of like the whole notion of a society being ruled by elders who had all of this. And there was, with this, divine monarchies, divine kingdoms, and such like that. But this is the third. This is the third of the fourth of the fourth. And with the third, it's always like the third attribute of the Spirit, and there's differentiation. And these people developed moods, and people would coalesce together by moods, the Toltecs, and they all had similar likes and dislikes because there's attractions and repulsions that work in the desire body and in the third attribute of the Spirit, in the human spirit. And that attraction, repulsion in the desire body made for lots of likes and dislikes, interests and indifferences. And these people would coalesce together over a common interest, and then they would migrate away, and then they'd start a new kingdom. And then they would do this, and then it was sort of like this was the beginning of nationalism. And it was nationalism based on taste, like hereditary memory kinds of tastes. Then we come to the fourth of the fourth of the fourth. I don't even know if I want to talk about it. because the fourth of the fourth of the fourth, the hardest of all of the material. There are Turanians that still live in the Orient yet, but they're just like there are still descendants of Toltecs that live in Central America. And we're not talking about the Oriental Turanians. We're talking about the original Turanians. These were the epitome of materialism. The divine kings became extremely power hungry. And they worshipped themselves. They worshipped themselves. They tried to make realistic, living-like statues of themselves, and then they would worship their own bodies or represented. This is the time of idolatry of the body. Obviously, there was great insecurity in this, and there was oppression. That the divine kings and the hierarchy, the aristocracy, were extremely repressive because they maintained their oppression by both magical and by physical means. And therefore they kept the weak weak so that they could harvest them for energy. This was a time of horrible black magic. This is as dark could get in the Atlantean times. This was materialism carried to its extreme. But now we're going past the end of the second third and into the third third. We're going to about the peoples that we're going to have a lot more to say about next time. The original Semites, not the modern Semites that include the Jews and Arabs. Something very different took place with these people. How are we doing? Are we at an hour? Oh, I better speed it up. Go on, just about near the end here. The original Semites developed thought. They moved from the negative pole of the reflecting ether to the positive pole of the reflecting ether. And rather than doing everything by memory, the memories had stuck far enough so that by connecting memory with memory, there was an ability to think, to see the relationship between cause and consequence. And when this occurred, when one could see one's causes and one's consequences, that thought ability to see that gave a measure of the ability to see oneself as a thinker. And this caused a self-control, the beginning of a self-control. The beginning of the self-control was over both the desires and the selfish actions. As a consequence, the Semites became much smaller. And they weren't involved with the, for example, the idolatry of the body like the Turanians. Now, because they thought, that doesn't mean that they pondered things heavily. It was much more like a crafty, cunning type of thought, because this was still in the passing into matter time, and it was important that they think about matter. And at this time, the thinking brought the etheric body much more in touch with the physical body. We're going to talk more about this. Previous to this, the people were natural magicians because they were half out of the body and they were seeing in the inner world. The process of focused thought caused them to bring the two bodies more into alignment, and then their perception became clear and distinct. And a certain amount of objectivity was the consequence. On the other hand, a loss of a lot of the involuntary spiritual vision that had been the property of all of the earlier Atlantean races was lost to the Semites by the awakening outwardly with brain-mind consciousness and that kind of objectivity closed off in involuntariness. The Akkadians, the original Akkadians. And finally, the seventh, I'm going to talk about the two together. The original Mongolians. Again, neither of these are same as those as groups of people given the same names today, because there's been quite a great difference of change both in body structure and in what was done. The Akkadians carried reason much further than the Semites, but they carried it beyond objectivity, and they produced a mentation about matter that became like almost superfluous. So they ramified lots of thought, and it became extremely complex. And the Akkadians were the first to deal with something like an experimental science. They tried to move the moon around, change their own destiny. They had things like magical means of dealing with agriculture. They even tried to have aviation. And they did succeed with that. But they did it all out of the ethers. They used somehow they captured the etheric energy that is released in the sprouting mechanism. And when they had once captured that energy, then they followed the magnetic fields of the earth, which associated with the ley lines and things like that, those connected types of points. But it was the beginning of a science, but it wasn't like our science. It wasn't just pure experimentation. And because they knew what they didn't know, but the materialistic things still stuck. See, the Semites had self associated with them, and they had that cunning. But this was carried a step further and a little bit more deviant, because the last are talking to states that are too far in the future. You know what I'm trying to say? The earlier ones are recapitulations of the past. The present is this one, and this is the one that's leading to the future. This is so far into future states. I'm talking about the analogy of something is always an expression of a recapitulatory expression of something that has been before, or it's an anticipation of an analogy